Good evening, friends. Ace Choir welcomes you to this virtual Holy Mass. This Mass was celebrated in the Archdiocese of Toronto by Father Chris. Before beginning the Mass, I request all of you to keep your phones in silent mode. Thank you. Let's make sign of the cross in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Let's all rise for entrance hymn.
Welcome to the celebration of the Daily TV Mass. My name is Father Chris Lemieux, Director of Vocations for the Archdiocese of Toronto. Today's homilist is Deacon Joshua Lobo. Deacon Joshua is a transitional deacon who will be ordained to the priesthood for the Archdiocese in the next few months. Our Daily TV Masses this week celebrate vocations, calling us all to pray for them. This Mass is being offered for the intentions of the members of the Sarah Clubs of Canada and Sarah International. Sarahs are lay Catholics, men and women of all ages and all walks of life, dedicated to promoting and praying for vocations. Sarah International is formally recognized by the Holy See as the global lay apostolate for vocations in the Catholic Church. An important part of the Sarah Club mission is to pray for vocations to the priesthood, religious life, and the permanent diaconate. All of us involved in the formation of the faithful for a religious vocation would like to thank the members of the Sarah Clubs across Canada and around the world for their prayers and their support. We invite all of you in the Daily TV Mass community to consider attending one of the local Sarah Clubs and becoming part of this apostolate for vocations. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the communion of the Holy Spirit be with you all.
And with your spirit.
As we begin our celebration of the Holy Eucharist, let us begin first by acknowledging our sins and asking for God's mercy. You were sent to heal the contrite of heart. Lord, have mercy.
Lord, have mercy.
You came to call sinners. Christ, have mercy.
Christ, have mercy.
You are seated at the right hand of the Father to intercede for us. Lord, have mercy.
Lord, have mercy.
May Almighty God have mercy on us, forgive us our sins, and bring us to everlasting life.
Amen.
Glory, glory.
O God, who open wide the gates of the heavenly kingdom to those reborn of water and the Holy Spirit, pour out on your servants an increase of the grace you have bestowed, that having been purged of all sins, they may lack nothing that in your kindness you have promised. Through our Lord Jesus Christ, your Son, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever.
Amen. In today's first reading, we will get to know that Stephen, who was stoned to death, and how during the persecution he felt the joy of self-surrender.
First reading, a reading from the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 7, verses 51 to chapter 8, verse 1. You stiff-necked people, uncircumcised in heart and ears, you are forever opposing the Holy Spirit, just as your ancestors used to do. Which of the prophets did your ancestors not persecute? They killed those who foretold the coming of the righteous one, and now you have become his betrayers and murderers. You are the ones that received the law as ordained by angels, and yet you have not kept it. When they heard these things, they became enraged and ground their teeth at Stephen. But, filled with the Holy Spirit, he gazed into heaven and saw the glory of God, and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. Look, he said, I see the heavens open, and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God. But they covered their ears, and with a loud shout all rushed together against him. Then they dragged him out of the city and began to stone him. And the witnesses laid their coats at the feet of a young man named Saul. While they were stoning Stephen, he prayed, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. Then he knelt down and cried out in a loud voice, Lord, do not hold this sin against them. When he had said this, he died. And Saul approved of their killing him. That day, a severe persecution began against the church in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout the countryside of Judea and Samaria. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Into your hands, O Lord, I entrust my spirit. Into your hands, O Lord, I entrust my spirit. Your
Let's all rise for acclamation.
Seek you first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. Hallelujah. Hallelujah.
In today's Gospel reading, we will hear that Jesus is the bread of life.
The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John.
Glory to you,
O Lord.
After Jesus had fed the crowd from the 5 loaves, the people said to Jesus, "What sign are you going to give us then, so that we may see it and believe in you? What work are you performing? Our ancestors ate the manna in the wilderness, as it is written, 'He gave them bread from heaven to eat.'" Then Jesus said to them, "Very truly I tell you, it was not Moses who gave you the bread from heaven, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is that which comes down from heaven and gives life to the world." They said to him, "Sir, give us this bread always." Jesus said to them, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Dear friends, my name, as Father Chris mentioned at the beginning of Mass, is Deacon Joshua Lobo, and I'm a transitional deacon who will be ordained shortly to the priesthood. So I ask for your prayers for myself, but also for my classmates. If we had a choice between being hungry or being satisfied, I think every single one of us would pretty much choose unanimously to be content and to be satisfied. As humans, we don't like the feeling of hunger, especially a physical hunger from a lack of food. But also, every one of us experiences a kind of longing or restlessness in our hearts, in our souls, a sort of spiritual hunger for something more. Our gospel today begins shortly after the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000, where Jesus himself feeds 5,000 people with 5 small barley loaves and 2 fish. But just shortly after this incredible miracle, this incredible sign, the people ask Jesus for a sign so that they may believe in him. They want the next thing. They ask him, "What else can you show us?" Isn't this like all of us humans? We always want more and more and more. I know I was like this growing up, always wanting the next gadget, or wanting to get out of 2nd grade, waiting for 3rd grade, or trusting that perhaps high school wasn't the best, but university would be better. Always waiting for the next thing, having the grass being greener on the other side, perhaps. But at the heart of our readings today is a simple message of good news. And Jesus gives us the solution for the longing and the restlessness in our hearts. And that solution is Himself. He is the answer to the hunger of our heart. He is the answer to our restlessness. I am the bread of life, He says. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty. And it is this, a deep, authentic relationship with Jesus, built on a strong foundation of prayer and trust, that will ensure that we will never be hungry or thirsty, that the restlessness of our hearts will be replaced with peace. I know this is the gift that the seminary has given me, the great gift of discerning my vocation. I felt a deep peace, and I'm no longer looking for the next thing or the next thing. I'm just happy being at peace with Jesus, being in a relationship with Him. Now, this relationship is built on an encounter with Him. And we encounter Him and are fed by Him in many different ways. By the Word of God, where His words counsel us, where they strengthen us, where they give us comfort and peace. We encounter Him in the sacraments, especially confession, where He forgives us and He restores us to a loving relationship with God, but also in the Blessed Sacrament, where He becomes our very food. We encounter Him in a life of prayer, when we speak to Him from our hearts. It is then that we will begin to trust that God will provide everything we need. Just as He provided manna for the Israelites in the desert for 40 years, just as He provided food for 5,000 in the desert out of 2 fish and a few loaves of bread. Just as He gave St. Stephen, in our first reading, who we hear about, just as He gave him great wisdom and eloquence and courage, just as He was with him at that moment of his death and gave him the grace to forgive his persecutors, so too will Jesus give us everything we need in every circumstance of our life. St. Paul tells us that nothing can ever separate us from the love of God. Nothing in all creation. There's only one obstacle in all of creation that can separate us from Jesus, and that is ourselves, if we do not choose to turn to Him and have a relationship with Him. Our message today is to trust in God, to never despair, even if we are in sin, to return to Him, for He is loving, He's compassionate, and He's merciful. Trust in God, in Jesus, that He Himself will satisfy every desire of our hearts, that Jesus Christ truly does satisfy. Listen once again to the words of the Lord. Take them deep into your heart and ponder on them. I am the bread of life, says the Lord. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry, and whoever believes in me will never thirst. Amen. Dear friends, we bring our petitions before our loving Father, trusting that He hears every one of them. We pray as a community of believers from many different places and countries, asking for the guidance of our Father in these difficult and trying times. We pray to the Lord.
Lord, hear our prayer.
For the Church, that many will hear and answer the call to work and labor for others. For the food that is eternal, we pray to the Lord.
Lord, hear our prayer.
For all of those in the daily TV Mass community that have asked to be included in our prayer intentions book, during this Easter season, the hope that comes from the risen Lord, may it strengthen those in our community suffering from physical or emotional difficulties. We pray to the Lord.
Lord, hear our prayer.
That all people, especially our young women and men, that they may be given the strength and courage to overcome fears and obstacles to follow the Lord in dedicated service. As religious sisters and brothers, we pray to the Lord.
Lord, hear our prayer.
For all those who are discerning a vocation to the holy priesthood, we pray to the Lord.
Lord, hear our prayer.
For all who are sick or suffering in any way, especially those who are in critical condition, that they may be given the strength, endurance, and healing according to the will of God, we pray to the Lord.
Lord, hear our prayer.
For all those who have died, and for the repose of their souls, that they may be welcomed joyfully into eternal life, we pray to the Lord.
Lord, hear our prayer.
Kind and merciful Lord, we give you thanks, especially in these precarious times, for all your gifts and blessings in our lives. Lord, we ask you to hear these prayers and those that remain in the silence of our hearts. And we make these prayers through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Blessed are you, Lord, God of all creation. Thanks to your goodness, this bread we offer, fruit of the earth, work of our hands. It will become the bread of life. Blessed be God. Blessed be God. Blessed be God forever. Amen. Blessed be God. Blessed be God. Blessed be God forever. Amen. Blessed are you, Lord, God of all creation. Thanks to your goodness, this wine we offer, fruit of the vine, work of our hands. It will become the cup of joy. Blessed be God. Blessed be God. Blessed be God forever. Amen. Blessed be God. Blessed be God. Blessed be God forever. Amen.
Pray that my sacrifice and yours may be acceptable to God, the Almighty Father.
May the Lord accept the sacrifice at your hands for the praise and glory of his name, forever and ever, for his holy church.
Receive, O Lord, we pray, these offerings of your exultant church, and as you have given her cause for such great gladness, grant also that the gifts we bring may bear fruit in perpetual happiness through Christ our Lord.
Amen.
The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit,
Lift up your hearts.
we lift them up to the Lord.
Let us give thanks to the Lord our God.
It is right and just.
It is truly right and just, our duty and our salvation, at all times to acclaim you, O Lord, but in this time above all to laud you yet more gloriously, when Christ our Passover has been sacrificed. Through him the children of light rise to eternal life, and the halls of the heavenly kingdom are thrown open to the faithful. For his death is our ransom from death, and in his rising the life of all has risen. Therefore, overcome with paschal joy, every land, every people exults in your praise. And even the heavenly powers with the angelic hosts sing together the unending hymn of your glory as they acclaim.
Holy, holy, holy Lord,
You are indeed holy, O Lord, the fount of all holiness. Make holy, therefore, these gifts, we pray, by sending down your Spirit upon them like the dewfall, so that they may become for us the body and blood of our Lord Jesus Christ. At the time he was betrayed and entered willingly into his passion, he took bread and, giving thanks, broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take this, all of you, and eat of it, for this is my body, which will be given up for you." In a similar way, when supper was ended, he took the chalice, and once more giving thanks, he gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take this, all of you, and drink from it, for this is the chalice of my blood, the blood of the new and eternal covenant, which will be poured out for you and for many, for the forgiveness of sins. Do this in memory of me." The mystery of faith.
We proclaim your death, O Lord, and profess your resurrection until you come again.
Therefore, as we celebrate the memorial of his death and resurrection, we offer you, Lord, the bread of life and the chalice of salvation, giving thanks that you have held us worthy to be in your presence and minister to you. Humbly we pray that, partaking of the body and blood of Christ, we may be gathered into one by the Holy Spirit. Remember, Lord, your church spread throughout the world, and bring her to the fullness of charity, together with Francis our Pope and Thomas our Bishop and all the clergy. Remember also our brothers and sisters who've fallen asleep in the hope of the resurrection, and all who've died in your mercy. Welcome them into the light of your face. Have mercy on us all, we pray, that with the Blessed Virgin Mary, Mother of God, with Blessed Joseph, her spouse, with the blessed apostles and all the saints who've pleased you throughout the ages, that we may merit to be co-heirs to eternal life, and may praise and glorify you through your Son, Jesus Christ. Through him and with him and in him, O God, Almighty Father, in the unity of the Holy Spirit, all glory and honor is yours forever and ever.
Amen.
At the Savior's command, informed by divine teaching, we dare to say,
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us, Lord, from evil.
Deliver us, Lord, we pray, from every evil. Graciously grant peace in our days, that by the help of your mercy, we may be always free from sin and safe from all distress, as we await the blessed hope and the coming of our Savior, Jesus Christ.
For the kingdom, the power, and the glory are yours, now and forever.
Lord Jesus Christ, who said to your apostles, "Peace I leave you, my peace I give you," look not on our sins, but on the faith of your church, and graciously grant her peace and unity in accordance with your will, who live and reign forever and ever.
Amen.
The peace of the Lord be with you always.
And with your spirit. Lamb of God, you take away the sin of the world, have mercy on us. Lamb of God, you take away the sin of the world, have mercy on us. Lamb of God, you take away the sin of the world, grant us peace.
as you are not getting the video, so we'll say the prayer. Lord, I'm not worthy
that you should enter under my roof, but only say a word, and my soul shall be healed. Since we cannot receive the Holy Communion, let us remember our first Holy Communion and the best moment when we receive the body and blood of Christ. Remembering that, let us partake in the spiritual communion by saying this prayer. O Immaculate Queen of heaven and earth, Mother of God and Creator of every grace, I believe that your dearly beloved Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, is truly, really, and substantially contained in the most holy sacrament. I love him above all things and long to receive him in my heart. Since now I cannot receive him sacramentally, be so good to place him spiritually in my soul and never permit me to be separated from him. Amen. Lord, you are my everything. Lord, you are my friend.
You're the sweetest name of all. Jesus, how I love to praise your name. Jesus, you're the first, the last, the same. Oh, Jesus, you died to take away my shame. You're the sweetest name of all. Jesus, you're the soon and coming King. Jesus, we need the love that you can bring. Oh, Jesus, we lift our voices up and sing. You're the sweetest name of all. You're the sweetest name of all.
Let us say the prayer after communion of St. Thomas. I thank you, Lord, Almighty Father, everlasting God, for having been pleased through no merit of mine, but of your great mercy alone, to feed me, a sinner, and your unworthy servant, with the precious body and blood of your Son, our Lord Jesus Christ. I pray that this Holy Communion may not be for my judgment and condemnation, but for my pardon and salvation. Let this Holy Communion be to me an armor of faith and a shield of goodwill, a cleansing of all vices and rooting out of all evil desires. May it increase love and patience, humility and obedience, and all virtues. May it be a firm defense against the evil designs of all my visible and invisible enemies, a perfect quieting of all the desires of soul and body. May this Holy Communion bring about a perfect union with you, the one true God, and at last enable me to reach eternal bliss when you will call me. I pray that you bring me a sinner to the indescribable feast where you, with your Son, our Lord Holy Spirit, are to your saints to life, full blessedness, everlasting joy, and perfect happiness, to the same Christ our Lord. Amen. We'll say the prayer for priest of Saint Therese. O Jesus, eternal priest, keep your priest within the shelter of your sacred heart. May none may touch them. Keep unstained their anointed hands, which daily touch your sacred body. Keep unsullied their lips, and dilute with your precious blood. Keep pure and unearthly their hearts, sealed with the sublime mark of the priesthood. Let your holy love surround them and shield them from the worst contagion. Bless their labors with abundant fruit, and may their souls, to whom they minister, be their joy and consolation here and in heaven, their beautiful and everlasting crown. Amen.
Let us pray. Look with kindness upon your people, O Lord, and grant, we pray, that those who you were pleased to renew by eternal mysteries may attain in their flesh the incorruptible glory of the resurrection. Through Christ our Lord.
Amen.
The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
May Almighty God bless you, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Go in peace, glorifying the Lord by your life.
Thanks be to God.
Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for He is good. Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for He is good. Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for He is good. Yes, eternal
Lord, thank you for your faithfulness to us. Many of us came to you with troubled hearts, fears, anxiety. And Lord, we have felt you during this Mass that you have washed us through your holy and precious blood. You have washed our all negativity. Lord, we thank you for that. We also thank you because it is through your word that we have found the freedom that we have been yearning for all weeks. Help us, Lord, to focus on you and your word of God, and not the things of this world that cause us to be depressed and anxious. For this we pray, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us, Lord, from evil. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou amongst women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen. We'll say the Memorare together. Remember, O most gracious Virgin Mary, that never was it known that anyone who fled to thy protection, implored thy help, or sought thy intercession was left unaided. Inspired with this confidence, I fly to thee, O Virgin of Virgins, my Mother. To thee do I come, before thee I stand, sinful and sorrowful. O Mother of the Word incarnate, despise not my petitions, but in thy mercy hear and answer me. Amen. O Queen of Heaven, rejoice now. Hallelujah. Rejoice, for he who married though despair. Hallelujah. He is risen as he foretold. Hallelujah. Pray for us to the Father. Hallelujah.
Rejoice and be glad, O Virgin Mary. Hallelujah.
For the Lord has truly risen. Hallelujah.
Let us pray.
O God, you came to give joy to the world through the resurrection of your Son, our Lord Jesus Christ. Grant, we beseech you, that through his mother, the Virgin Mary, we may obtain the joys of everlasting life. Through the same Christ our Lord. Amen. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Virgin Mary, pray for us. Saint Joseph, pray for us. Saint Josemaria Escriva, pray for us. Saint Faustina, pray for us. Let's all make sign of the cross in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Thank you, friends, for joining us in this virtual Holy Mass. Have a blessed week ahead. Stay safe and take precautions.